Welcome to Ciro's annual holiday broadcast, coming to you live from the legendary Ciro's Nightclub in Hollywood. I'm Steve Welch, your host for this evening, and tonight we bring you music from Mark Gus Scott and original Christmas stories written and read by Ken Barr. And now, The Coming of Claus by Ken Barr.
Hello, my name is Ken Barr, and I'm here to tell you a story that my grandfather told me many times growing up. You see, this is his story. I never actually met Mr. Claus myself. I only know him from my grandfather's stories. He grew up with him. Mr. Claus was not always Santa. That was something he grew into, something he became out of need. When my grandpa knew him, his name was Chris Thomas, and he was just another guy from the neighborhood. Chris and my grandpa lived in the poor side of town. They didn't have much, but they always managed to get by, sometimes barely. Growing up the way he did had an impact on Chris that he would carry his whole life. Living on the poor side of town meant moving a lot. As one landlord threw the family out for being behind a few months on the rent, the family would scramble to find a new place that they could get into quickly. Otherwise, it would be a long couple of nights on the street or hitting up a distant relative for a little floor space to sleep on. Chris always had a hard time starting over, making new friends. Eventually he stopped trying, knowing it was only a matter of time before the family would be on the move again. My grandpa Will had always made a point of finding Chris wherever he and his family ended up. Since my grandpa was as poor as he was, Chris never felt self-conscious about my grandpa seeing where he lived. The places usually weren't very nice, and the family never had much. The area that this story takes place in was called Lowtown. That's not the name you'll see on the map, that's the name its residents gave it. Most people would say, you can't get any lower than this place, so that's why they called it Lowtown. Life for Chris was always hard, and times were tough in those days. Work was scarce, and even as an adult he had a hard time staying in one place. He had a lonely life. The scars of all the childhood moves left him isolated and with no confidence to ask a girl out. All these issues led to alcohol, and before he knew what happened, Chris was out on the street, panhandling for change just to go to the liquor store. Times had been hard up to now, but they were rapidly getting worse. Winter was coming, and Chris didn't have a place to live or proper clothing to keep warm. One day on the street, a Salvation Army worker saw Chris out in the cold as she stood on the sidewalk ringing her bell. She took pity on him. She went to her car and took out her old winter coat and gave it to him. It was a red lady's coat, but it fit, and it was warm. That moment of charity never left Chris. That may have been the beginning of his salvation. Not long after, it was another cold night on the street. A truck drove by and hit a bump. The bump dislodged a box from the back and it tumbled to the ground. Chris went over to grab it. Returning it to the driver might mean a reward, but he was too late. The truck was gone, and he opened up the box to see that it was full of toys. What was he going to do with toys, he thought. His first instinct was to take them to the pawn shop, which he did. The pawnbroker told him the toys were worthless, no money there. Dejected, Chris walked the streets of Lowtown carrying the box. After a while, he came upon a woman and child who were also on hard times. Suddenly he thought of the toys, and he took one from the box and gave it to the child. Seeing the joy on the child's face was a turning point for Chris. Something so small had meant so much to that child. He spent the rest of the night looking for children to give the rest of the toys to. It was past midnight when he finished, and he also realized for the first time in a long time he hadn't had a drink. From that day on, Chris was a different man. It took a while for him to finally shake his addictions, but his newest addiction, bringing joy to children by bringing them toys, became not only his strongest addiction, ultimately it was his salvation. Eventually, Chris was able to find steady work and a place to call home. He became a model employee at his job, but remained a quiet and solitary person outside of work. He never forgot the feeling that first year of giving those first few toys. Throughout the year, he collected toys from anyone he could get to donate. He spent all his free time finding broken, discarded toys to bring home and fix. He became an expert toy repairman and soon an expert toy builder. He could make toys that children would love out of just about anything that he could find. And when Christmas came, he was ready. He had worked on that red Christmas coat, made it nicer, and even made pants to go with it. He felt that the holiday needed someone bigger than Chris Thomas to deliver toys, someone universal. When he donned his red Christmas suit, he became someone else. He struggled for a name, something to call himself as he made his holiday rounds. Finally, he remembered the baker that used to give him leftover rolls to eat when he was homeless, Mr. Claus. That was it. That was the name, Claus. Originally, he had planned on going by just the one name, but while giving presents one year, a tearful, grateful woman thanked him and told him that he was a saint for saving their Christmas. While he appreciated the compliment, Claus explained that he was just a man doing what he could. He was far from a saint. The woman then said to him, "If I can't call you a saint, then I'd like to call you Santa, another word of endearment that will mean saint to my family. You are our Santa Claus." With a tearful eye, Claus agreed, and from that day on, every Christmas, he was Santa Claus. As time went by, Santa Claus became more and more of a household name. People started helping where they could. Whether it was the donation of a toy or money to buy toys, people started to do whatever they could. And as the years went by, Santa was also able to recruit help for his Christmas rounds. He hadn't forgotten where he came from and how hard it was living on the street. When Santa came upon someone living on the street, whether they had addictions or not, he would take them in and try to help. Not everyone stayed, not everyone wanted to be helped, but what was important was that some did. Some could be saved, and some of those, not all, but some wanted to help. They became Santa Claus's first helpers, and so it went. Giving gifts to children at Christmas was becoming a big Christmas tradition, not just in Lowtown. Santa Claus was becoming known far and wide. One year, while Santa was still working at his job that he had started while he was still Chris Thomas, he was going home after work and had stopped into one of the charitable organizations that were always so good about donating. He went inside to see his friend Ray, who had always been so generous. "Santa," Ray said, "let me introduce you to our new volunteer, Sigrid." Santa turned to look and saw the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He nervously shook her hand and introduced himself. "So wonderful to finally meet you," she said. "I'd love to help however I can." Santa asked her to dinner that night, and that was it. After that night, they were inseparable, and soon completely in love. And yes, not long after, Sigrid became Mrs. Claus. With Sigrid by his side and all of his helpers working on toys, word had spread far and wide about Santa's good deeds. More and more people wanted to help. Donations of money and toys were literally pouring in. Now the problem was room, space to do all the work. Their annual Christmas gift giving had far outgrown the apartment they had been in since the beginning. Once again, fortune smiled on Santa and his people. Mr. Claus, the baker from whom Santa had taken his name, had a big house outside of town on a big piece of property, and he wanted to donate it to help as much as he could. It seems that the house was far out of town, far to the north, too far for Claus the baker to drive to very often. It was also a very big house, and Mr. Claus just couldn't take care of it. It was just too much. And so the final piece was finally put in place. Santa moved his entire operation north to the Claus house. How fitting. There they were, able to flourish. There was a constant influx of people wanting to help, so much so that some people were able to use some of the land to grow food and farm. Buildings were built, space was made, and Christmas had become a year-round job and had grown beyond anything that anyone could have predicted. From the alcoholic streets of Lowtown to bringing joy to the world, there certainly is a special magic to Christmas.
O Holy Night by Mark Gus Scott. And now, Santa's Best Friend by Ken Barr.
Sigrid was a big happy dog that had lived with his family since he was a pup. Mama, Papa, Billy, and Sarah. There was always someone to play with, good food in his bowl, and a warm place to sleep. He was always a happy pup, and he was showered with love every day by his family. And in return, he showed his love for them, giving them kisses whenever he could. Life was just a continuous cycle of walks on his leash, trips to the park, car rides, and the occasional nap. Sigrid would sometimes think to himself, life is good. Sigrid was just going through his normal routine when he noticed things starting to change. His papa had stopped leaving for work in the mornings, and if he understood correctly, Papa had lost his job, which meant that there was no money coming in to pay for food. At night, Sigrid could hear Papa and Mama talking loud, like they did when something was wrong. He just hid under Billy's bed, hoping things would be okay. One night, Sigrid was sitting on the bed with Billy and Sarah, and they were both crying. They could hear their Papa tell Mama, "It's the only way, and it will be for the best." Billy and Sarah started crying even more as Papa came into the room to get Sigrid. "Children," Papa said, "say goodbye to Sigrid. We can't afford to take care of him any more. I have to take him away." Sarah and Billy both burst into tears and hugged Sigrid, begging their Papa not to take him. But after a tearful farewell, Papa and Sigrid walked out the door. As they got into the car, Sigrid could see that Papa had been crying too. He just didn't want Billy and Sarah to see it. Papa hugged him and told him he loved him and that he was sorry. He took the tags from Sigrid's collar, all except for the one with his name. He wanted to make sure that people would know what to call him. They drove for what seemed like hours, and Sigrid saw a familiar sight, the dog park, a place he had been playing in since he was a pup. He and Papa got out of the car and walked to the park. Papa hugged Sigrid one last time and said, "I love you, Sigrid. I am so sorry. This will be the best place for you to find a family that can take care of you." And with that, Sigrid's Papa walked to the car and drove off, leaving Sigrid alone for the first time in his life. Sigrid was so scared, he ran after the car, barking so his Papa could hear, but it was no use. There was no way he could keep up with the car. He went back to the park and cried. He cried for the Papa who had just left him. He cried for the family he was afraid he'd never see again. But most of all, he cried because he was scared and alone. After a while, Sigrid realized he had to figure out how he was going to live. It was getting dark and he was getting hungry. Today had been one of those few days that no one came to the park, so there wasn't anyone that could help. So he struck out on his own to find something to eat and a place to sleep. His walk took him to some big buildings with people coming and going, getting food. He had seen Mama and Papa go to these kinds of places when times were better. Sigrid could smell food in a big metal container at the back of the building. People were just throwing their uneaten food into it. With all this food, there must be a way to get some. He decided to sit near the container. Perhaps someone would give him something to eat if he just sat nice and was a good boy. And he was right. A man came over to him and scratched behind his ears. "Hungry, boy?" the man said. Sigrid just licked his lips. He was so hungry. The man put some food down for Sigrid, and he ate it as fast as he could. And with that, the man said, "Gotta get back to work. Take care, boy." The man went inside, and Sigrid didn't see him again. So now it was time to find a place to sleep, and Sigrid was able to find a little shed to sleep in. It was drafty and cold, and all Sigrid could think about was getting home to his family. He had to find them. "Rest up," he thought to himself. "Tomorrow I find home." But tomorrow he didn't find home, or the next day. It was all he could do to find something to eat and a place to sleep. There were days he couldn't find food and went hungry. Some days people chased him and threw rocks. He couldn't understand. All he wanted was to go home. But he had to keep looking, so he wandered. Not knowing where to go, he did his best. He didn't realize it, but he was going in the wrong direction. He was going north, further and further from home. And as he went further north, there were less and less people and houses. Sigrid couldn't understand. He thought every place was like home, but it was getting colder and harder to find food. After much walking and not much food, Sigrid came upon the first house he had seen in days. He decided to go onto the front porch and see if anyone was home. So he got on the porch and barked. He barked for all he was worth. And after a few minutes, Fortune smiled at him. An older man came to the door. He smiled when he saw Sigrid and opened the door fully. "Well, what do we have here?" the man said. He reached down and scratched Sigrid behind his ears just like Papa had. "Best get you inside and get you something to eat," he continued. The house was so warm and cozy, Sigrid went over and lay by the fire while the man got him something to eat. And when the food was ready, the man gave a whistle, and Sigrid went over to find the best-smelling food he had ever smelled, and lots of it. He immediately started to gobble the food up. "Easy, boy," the man said. "No one's going to take that food from you." After dinner, Sigrid lay by the fire and fell asleep, feeling safe for the first time in a long time. When morning came, the man gave Sigrid more food, and after breakfast the man started to tell him about the day they were going to have. "Well, Sigrid, my name is Wilfred Pine, and I've been living here most of my life. Now you seem like a fine dog, but I can barely manage myself. As much as I'd love to have you stay here with me, I just can't manage it. But don't worry, I won't just turn you out. I have a friend nearby that might be able to help." Sigrid didn't know what the man was saying, but somehow he knew things would be all right. The man put his coat on and called to Sigrid, and they went outside and got into the man's truck. They only drove for a short time, and Sigrid saw the fanciest building he had ever seen. There were many buildings, in fact. They got out of the truck and went to the biggest building, and the man knocked on the door as though he had been here many times before. The door was opened by a friendly-looking gray-haired woman who was happy to see the man. After they hugged, she looked at Sigrid and said, "And who might this be?" Wilfred told the woman that his name was Sigrid and he was looking for a home for him. They were invited inside, and the woman said she would be right back. After a few minutes, she came back with a tray of treats for all of them, and an older man who immediately recognized Wilfred. "What do we have here?" he asked. "Well, Santa, his name is Sigrid, and he needs a home. He arrived last night. I would like to keep him with me, but I just can't. I was hoping you might be able to let him stay here." "Well, I don't know," said Santa. "We've never had a dog here before." Wilfred responded, "He's a great dog, Santa. Won't you please just give him a chance?" "All right, Wilfred," said Santa. "I could never say no to someone in need of help." And with that, Wilfred scratched Sigurd's head and said, "I'll see you soon, boy." He then shook Santa's hand and said, "I'll see you Saturday night for cards, Santa." "Get home safely, Wilfred," said Santa. And that's how it happened. Sigurd didn't just have a home, he had a new family that loved him. Mr. and Mrs. Claus, Wilfred stopped by often, and there were all sorts of people building toys and doing all sorts of magical things, and one by one, they all fell in love with Sigurd. He would help out where he could, helping with packages or carrying supplies. Every day was a new adventure, and Sigurd just loved his home. And there was a special bond between Sigurd and Santa. When Sigurd barked, Santa understood what he was trying to say, and he could understand Santa as well. In just a very short time, they had become very, very close. When it came time for Santa to make his trip delivering toys, he decided to ask Sigurd if he'd like to come and help. Sigurd had proven himself very adept at carrying packages and helping. Besides, he'd be good company on the ride. So off they went, delivering toys. Sigurd was so excited to be bringing presents to all the children. After a few stops, Sigurd started to get the hang of things and proved himself a big help with deliveries. Santa already knew he had made the right choice. House after house, they all became a blur, until one house in particular. Sigurd recognized the place. It was his old house. That meant that Billy and Ciro were here. He went looking, and in his excitement, he accidentally woke them up. They were so excited to see him, they all hugged and cried, waking Mama and Papa, who also cried when they saw him. Papa held Sigurd and said, "I am so very sorry, Sigurd. I went back to look for you, and you were gone. I am so sorry. Please, can you stay?" But Sigurd had a new family now and couldn't leave them. They all hugged and cried for so long, finally Santa had to say something. "We really must be going, but I promise you that I will bring Sigurd with me every year to visit." So they said goodbye, but not really goodbye, more of a see you again soon. And they did. As good as his word, Santa brought Sigurd with him every year and woke the family up when they got there. And more than that, Sigrid got to visit his old family during the year. Santa made sure. And as the years went on, and Sarah and Billy grew up and had families of their own, their children got to know Sigrid as well. You see, from that first trip on, Santa made his trip each year with Sigrid by his side. They were inseparable, the best of friends.
Ave Maria from Mark Gus Scott. And now, Ken Barr with his story, The Rest of the Year.
It was just another night at the local pub. All the usual regulars drinking in their usual spots. Sitting at a table all the way in the back were three friends anxiously waiting for their friend Jacob to arrive. They were the spirits of Christmas past, present, and future. You see, as it was December 26th, the three spirits had fulfilled their holiday obligation and were now trying to figure out what the rest of their year might bring. Being spirits didn't relieve them of their obligations of finding lodgings and suitable employment. They had all hoped for some sort of ghostly position that might land them something to hold on to in the coming years. Maybe a good castle haunting or a good haunted forest where they could ply their trade full time. As it was, they had to take whatever they could get to remain gainfully employed for the rest of the year. They were hoping that the spirit of Jacob Marley, who had helped them get their Christmas jobs, might be able to help. "I just can't spend another season as the greeter for that store. Not one more season," said Ambrose. That's what the spirit of Christmas yet to come was called. "My manager is a buffoon who enjoys making fun of my appearance. I can't help it if I scare children." It was easy to see he had been frustrated by this for quite some time. "My job's not any better," said Campbell, the spirit of Christmas past. "As an assistant in a law firm, I have to deal with people far worse than Mr. Scrooge every day. Horrible, horrible people that delight in the suffering of others, and my work helps them hurt people. I want nothing more than to leave, but it's so hard to find work. And when you start a new job, it can be so difficult to get Christmas off." "As bad as your situation sounds," said Simeon, the spirit of Christmas present, "I would trade with you in a moment." With a heavy sigh, he explained, "As the spirit of Christmas present, my time is limited to that time of year. After the holiday, I am gone until the following year. If I could only find a situation that would keep me busy throughout the rest of the year. Give me a bell tower to haunt, for heaven's sake. I would haunt a horse stall if I could. Anything." And so another round of drinks was ordered, and the three old friends talked about their difficulties: bad roommates, abusive employers, lack of work in the spirit world, getting the holidays off so that they could do their holiday haunting, so many things. Suddenly they heard the familiar sounds of the door opening, chains and boxes scraping as they dragged on the floor, then the door closing on the chain as each metal cash box got caught on the door and their friend tried to enter. After fighting the door for a number of minutes, there he stood, at their table. It was the spirit of Jacob Marley himself. "Hello, my friends," he said with a sparkle in his eyes. "So good to see you." He motioned to the barkeep for another round of drinks. "I'd like to thank you three for another job well done. You are truly the spirits of Christmas." And with that, Jacob raised a glass and they toasted, smiles all around. Simeon was the first to speak up. "Tell me, Jacob, any word of employment for us?" "Ah, Simeon, my old friend, I wish that I had word of employment, but it has gotten increasingly difficult. You see, a man named Dickens wrote a book about us, a Christmas book where he describes us and all that we do. In so doing, he has made us synonymous with being Christmas spirits. No one will hire us for anything else," said Jacob. "Whatever shall we do? We can't continue as we are," said Ambrose, holding back tears. "Well, friends, as I said, this book by Dickens is quite popular, and it brings in quite a sum, every year. Have any of you ever heard of a royalty?" asked Marley. They hadn't, so Jacob explained to them that when a book was written, anyone directly written about was entitled to a percentage of profits. And as the book was directly about them, they were entitled to a very nice yearly sum. "What if this Dickens refuses to pay us our royalty?" asked Campbell. "Well, we are the Christmas spirits after all," said Marley. "Let's pay our author friend a visit. We straightened out Scrooge. This Dickens fellow will be child's play after that." And off into the night they went, to secure their futures, finally. The last time any of them were seen, they were dressed in the finest silks, and none of them had any more complaints or worries about their jobs. In fact, someone said that Simeon had bought a castle of his own, which he haunts by himself every night. Every night, that is, except Christmas.
Symphony for Christmas Eve by Mark Gus Scott. And now a new tale from the Icelandic Yule lads, Sausage Swiper.
From the icy caves of Iceland he comes. The world knows him as Sausage Swiper. He and his brothers, the Yule lads, are known the world over as bringers of Christmas presents and also holiday pranks. Each brother has a different mischief that they do when they come to town for the holidays. Sausage Swiper is known for going into people's smokehouses and stealing as much sausage as he can. It is his all-time favorite food. It is amazing how much sausage he steals. It's an amazing amount of food to eat. Well, as it happens, there's quite a bit more to the story than we've heard so far. As it turns out, many years ago, when the holidays were over and the long cold winter had set in, Sausage Swiper decided to travel around the outskirts of Iceland to visit the less populated areas that he never got to see during Christmas. It amazed him how few the homes were and how far apart. These people were truly on their own with very little to get by. He had met many people on his trip, and he was always surprised by their generosity. Whenever someone saw him out in the cold, he was invited into the house to have something to help warm him up. What amazed him still was how little these people had, and they still shared it with him. These families had a long winter to get through and family members to take care of, and yet they offered him what little they had. Each house he visited, it was the same. Hot food and drink, a place by the fire to sleep, and in the morning, a small bundle of food to take with him. This was nothing like anything he had ever experienced. He had family, but not like these people. He had always prided himself on how hard-hearted he was, especially with the holiday mischief, but now things were different. He had developed a soft spot for these people. His brothers could never know, but he had decided to do whatever he could for all these people he now called friend. And the following year, Sausage Swiper was as good as his word. Yes, he stole sausage from those that could afford it, those that had more than they could ever eat. He would load his sled up and ride to the outskirts as quick as he could. Late at night, he would deliver parcels of sausage to all the families that would otherwise go hungry. He did this at night because the families were too proud to take a handout. He would leave each parcel with a note, "From your friend, Sausage Swiper." And that was it. The families made it through the winter without hunger, and Sausage Swiper was never found out by his brothers. So as you read this, if you run into one of the Yule lads, please don't mention a word of this. Sausage Swiper still has his reputation to think about. Merry Christmas!
That's our show for this evening. See you next year, everyone. This has been an original production from an original concept by Ken Barr. Music by Mark Gus Scott. Stories by Ken Barr. Recording produced by Roy Louden. And of course, me, your host, Steve Welch. Good night, everybody. Merry Christmas.